Well, welcome to The Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where we think through various claims made by the Catholic Church concerning issues of faith, morality, and culture, and provide reasons behind those claims. I'm Dr. Carlo Broussard, staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers at Catholic.com, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization team here at the Diocese of Tulsa and Eastern Oklahoma. The Catholic Reason airs locally here in Tulsa every Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. on St. Michael Catholic Radio, 94.9 and 102.9, and across the entire Oklahoma Catholic Radio network of 11 stations, including 97.3 FM Oklahoma City, 100.9 in Edmond, and 88.3 FM in Lawton. But you may be listening at a different time on your own local Catholic station outside Oklahoma, since The Catholic Reason is aired on other Catholic stations throughout the country. Regardless of where you're at, welcome and thanks for joining me today. Remember, you can download the show through whichever podcast platform that you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. And you can also access the archived episodes at my website, carlobroussard.com, under both the audio and video tab. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the doctrine of hell. But we're going to focus only on the Church's magisterial teaching on hell. There are several questions that arise that we need to address as Catholics. We'll save the biblical teaching on hell for another time and another episode. The questions that we want to answer today are as follows. What is the precise teaching of the Church on hell? Does it teach merely the possibility of someone going to hell, or does it have a teaching on the factuality of hell? That is, that people will in fact go. And if it does have a teaching on the factuality of hell, does it teach that hell will be populated merely at the end of time, after the final judgment, or does it say anything about hell being populated right now? These are the questions that I want to answer today by the end of today's episode. So let's start with the magisterial teaching on at least the possibility of hell. And what I mean by possibility of hell will become evident as we go through the material here. So let's start with the Catechism of the Catholic Church. In paragraph 1035, the Catechism states this: the teaching of the Church affirms the existence of hell and its eternity. Now, you might think the Catechism is affirming that the factual population of hell, excuse me, let me rephrase that. You might think that the Catechism is affirming the factual population of hell, since it says hell is real and eternal. But notice what it says next in that same paragraph. Immediately after death, the souls of those who die in a state of mortal sin descend into hell, where they suffer the punishments of hell, quote unquote, eternal fire. Notice the Catechism doesn't affirm that there will in fact be souls that die in a state of mortal sin. Rather, it's saying those who die, the implication being that only if someone dies in a state of mortal sin, they will go to hell. Such a conditional statement allows for the possibility that perhaps none will die in such a state of mortal sin, and therefore hell would not be factually populated, at least by human beings. Later, in paragraph 1056, the Catechism speaks of hell again, stating, quote, following the example of Christ, the Church warns the faithful of the sad and lamentable reality of eternal death, also called hell. Here, it seems a bit stronger because it speaks of the reality of hell, but someone could counter that this is merely a brief statement at the end of the section and must be read in light of the conditional statement that came before in paragraph 1035. So that's the Catechism of the Catholic Church, to where we at least have the Church teaching on the possibility of hell, on the possibility that some could die in a state of mortal sin and end up in hell. Now, another example is Benedict XII's declaration in his 1336 dogmatic constitution, Benedictus Deus, where he writes this: according to God's general ordinance, the souls of those who die in a personal grievous sin descend immediately into hell, where they will be tormented by the pains of hell. Like the paragraph in the Catechism, this is merely a conditional statement. If a soul dies in grievous sin, he will descend immediately into hell. So this statement from Pope Benedict XII doesn't get us factual damnation, that there will in fact be souls in hell, but it does at least give us the possibility of somebody dying in a state of mortal sin and therefore ending up in hell. Now, we also have statements from both the councils of Lyon, speaking of the real possibility of hell. The first council, which was held in 1245, stated this: if, and there's the conditional statement, if anyone without repentance dies in mortal sin, without a doubt he is tortured forever by the flames of eternal hell. Again, that's the first council of Lyon. In 1274, the Second Council of Lyon reiterated the same teaching. Quote, the souls of those who die in mortal sin, or with original sin only, however, immediately descend to quote-unquote hell, yet to be punished with different punishments. Now, just a brief comment there on this idea of punishment or hell for original sin only. Notice there's a distinction between the damned and the punishment of the damned for those who die in a state of mortal sin, and what is calling punishments for those who die only in a state of original sin. What the council means there is not that if a soul were to die only with the state of original sin, that he would be among the damned or experiencing torments like the damned. What the council refers to by punishment of the souls of those who die only in original sin simply refers to that individual not experiencing the beatific vision. But notice the conditional statement: if a soul dies only with original sin, he cannot experience the beatific vision. Whether in fact there are souls who die only with the state of original sin, say like an infant who dies without baptism, that is something that the church does not address. It is only stating the principle that a soul with original sin would not be able to enter into the beatific vision. That's all the council is stating here. But with regard to hell, as we properly understand it, namely damnation, the Second Council of Lyon is teaching that it's at least possible for someone to die in a state of mortal sin and therefore immediately descend into quote-unquote hell, that is, hell in the sense of damnation. Now, these quotes that I've shared with you so far are just a sampling, but the conditional nature of their formulations can easily leave someone with the impression that the church is merely teaching that hell is a real possibility without touching on the factuality of hell. That is to say, whether souls are in fact there currently or at least will in fact eventually end up there. And I think a case can be made, however, that the church, at least in her ordinary magisterium, envisions factual damnation and not mere hypothetical damnation. And I state that because, given the conditional statements from the Catechism and Benedict XII and the two councils of Lyon, the question would naturally arise, does the church have anything to say about factual damnation? Something that would go beyond the possibility of someone being damned, a human being being damned. And I answer that question in the affirmative. I do think we have enough evidence, at least from the ordinary magisterium of the church, that can lead us to the conclusion to say the church does envision factual damnation. And then, of course, that that's going to raise questions about, well, is it current factual damnation or merely factual damnation at the end of time after the final judgment? And we'll get to that later in today's episode. Now, one brief note about ordinary magisterium. What that refers to is official teaching of the church, but not infallible teaching of the church. Ordinary magisterial teachings require from us as Catholics what Lumen Gentium called from the Second Vatican Council religious submission of intellect and will, where we submit to the teaching and we acknowledge it to be true, but with a qualified assent. That is to say, we recognize in principle it's possible to be erroneous or in error, but nevertheless, we assent to it. Whereas infallible teaching requires an assent that's full and definitive and no possibility of error. And so that's just a brief note on the ordinary magisterium. Nevertheless, it is official church teaching. Now, the question of factual damnation in magisterial teaching can be further divided, as I mentioned already, into two questions. Does the church envision factual damnation at least at the end of time, after the final judgment? And then secondly, does the church envision factual damnation currently? That's to say, are there souls in hell right now? So we're going to focus on the first question and whether the church envisions factual damnation at least at the end of time. That's going to be our focus initially. So we can start with the AD 543 Synod of Constantinople. So the Synod of Constantinople in AD 543, which was a local synod convened to condemn Origen and his views, early 3rd century theologian, one of which was the idea that all will be saved in the end. Origen was teaching that, and this synod is going to address that. But we're going to have to hit the pause button, come back to this local synod on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. Well, welcome back to The Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I'm Dr. Carlo Broussard. In today's episode, we're looking at the church's teaching on the doctrine of hell. So far in our first segment, we looked at some magisterial references to at least the possibility of hell. That it's possible some human beings could, and I emphasize could, in fact, die in a state of mortal sin and thereby end up in hell, that's to say damnation. But once we see the church's teaching on the possibility of hell, that raises the question of whether the church envisions factual damnation. That is to say, the question of whether human souls in fact end up in hell. But the question of factual damnation within the magisterial teaching can be further divided into two questions. Does the church envision factual damnation at least at the end of time after the final judgment? And does the church envision factual damnation currently? That's to say, are there souls in hell right now? Now, I'm going to answer in the affirmative for both questions. I do think there is at least ordinary magisterial teaching that suggests the church envisions factual damnation, both for at least souls being in hell at the end of time after the final judgment, and even currently so. So we're going to focus on the first question of whether the church envisions factual damnation. Now, before our last break, I began to tee up a reference to a local synod, the Synod of Constantinople in AD 543, which was convened to condemn Origen, an early 3rd century theologian, and his views, one of which was the idea that all would be saved in the end. Here's the relevant text, which is Canon 7 of this local synod. If anyone says or holds that the punishment of the demons and of impious men is temporary, and that it will have an end at some time, that is to say, there will be a complete restoration of the demons or of impious men, let him be anathema. To state this canon more positively, the punishment of demons and impious men is not temporary. Therefore, there will not be a complete restoration of demons or impious men. And the punishment is not referring to earthly punishment, it's referring to afterlife punishment. This complete restoration that the canon targets is a restoration that takes place at the final judgment at the end of time. So insofar as the canon says such a complete restoration will not take place, it's teaching that at least after the final judgment, there will be in fact demons and impious men who will be punished forever with the torments of hell. So I argue, someone might counter and say, well, this canon is only targeting the question of whether the punishments of hell are temporary without indicating whether there are human souls that factually suffer everlasting punishment. In other words, this canon is only saying that if there are souls that end up in hell, they will suffer everlastingly. Can you see the counter there? It's trying to suggest that this Canon 7 from the Synod of Constantinople in 543 AD is simply stating something in a conditional way. If souls are in hell, they will suffer forever. But I don't think this works. So here are my thoughts. The reason is because the canon doesn't just speak about the punishments of impious men, but also demons. The church doesn't believe the punishment of demons is merely hypothetical, like if demons end up there, they will suffer eternally. The church doesn't believe that. According to theologian Ludwig Ott in his book, Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, on page 121, it's part of divine revelation that Satan and his demons are definitively separated from God. Now, if this belief, it's this belief that is the basis for the question of whether their punishments are temporary. And the answer is no. Now, the canon lists impious men and their punishments right alongside demons as the target for the question of whether their punishments are temporary. Why would the question presuppose the factual damnation of the demons and not presuppose the factual damnation of impious men? That doesn't make sense. That would be an unnatural reading of the text, given that background knowledge of the factual damnation of demons. So, since the factual damnation of demons is presupposed by the question that the canon addresses, it's reasonable to infer that the factual damnation of impious men would be presupposed by the question as well, which means, at least at the end of time, after the final judgment, some impious men will in fact suffer everlasting punishment. So I think our appeal to Canon 7 from this local Synod of Constantinople in AD 543 provides us sufficient evidence that the church is envisioning factual damnation of human souls at least after the final judgment. Now, there's a bit of controversy surrounding this canon and whether it's actually magisterial or not, since it didn't make it into the Acts of the Second Council of Constantinople in 553. However, we do have evidence that it has magisterial authority. First, the Catechism in paragraph 1035 cites this canon from the Synod of Constantinople as authoritative in footnote 617. So we have the Catechism affirming the magisterial authority of this local synod. Again, not infallible, that is true, but nevertheless, officially magisterial. Second, in its index of citations, under the heading of particular councils and synods, the Catechism lists the Synod of Constantinople in AD 543 and thereby affirms its magisterial authority, giving it magisterial weight. And then third, according to scholarly research sourced in Denzinger, The Sources of Catholic Dogma, and the Peter Hunerman edition on page 144, a Christian Roman statesman named Cassiodorus, in his On Divine Literary Institutions, indicates to us that Pope Vigilius, who reigned from 537 to 555, confirmed the Synod of Constantinople in AD 543. Here's the excerpt from Cassiodorus. It appears that he, evidently speaking about Origen there, has nevertheless in the present time been condemned anew by Vigilius the Pope, a most blessed man. And scholars see in that excerpt from Considerius an affirmation of Pope Vigilius confirming the Synod of Constantinople in AD 543, therefore giving Canon 7 magisterial weight, even though that particular canon did not make it into the Acts of the Second Council of Constantinople in 553. So the 543 Synod of Constantinople does reasonably provide us with evidence that the Church envisions factual damnation at least after the final judgment at the end of time. Now, I think we can make an argument for factual damnation at least after the final judgment from the Church's teaching on the final judgment itself. Let's start with the Fourth Lateran Council's Confession of Faith. Here's what it declared. Jesus descended in soul, and he arose in the flesh, and he ascended equally in both, to come at the end of time, to judge the living and the dead, and to render to each according to his works, to the wicked, as well as to the elect, all of whom will rise with their bodies which they now bear, that they may receive according to their works, whether these works have been good or evil. The latter, everlasting punishment with the devil, that would be the wicked, and the former, the righteous, everlasting glory with Christ. Notice the council declares that the final judgment will involve both the wicked and the elect, the implication being that not everyone will be numbered among the elect. Also, it's important to note that the council fathers don't state this confession of faith in the hypothetical. If there are some wicked, they will enter into everlasting punishment with the devil. If someone wanted to argue that this confession of faith only implies a hypothetical concerning the wicked, well, then why not use the same principle for the elect? Should we say that this confession of faith only implies that if there are some who are not wicked will enter, should we say that this confession of faith only implies that if there are some who are not wicked, there it is, some who are not wicked, that is to be say righteous, will enter everlasting glory with Christ? Of course not. We affirm that those who will be, there will in fact be some numbered among the elect. Some will enter glory. That is a fact. And that's the presupposition of this confession of faith. So if the presupposition for the elect is that there will be factual salvation for some, well, then it's reasonable to infer that there is a presupposition of factual damnation for the wicked, and that the wicked is not a conditional statement, just like those who will enter into everlasting glory is not a condition. Okay, so that is a reference to the Fourth Lateran Council's Confession of Faith in 1215. Now, we also have some references in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraphs 998 and 1038, that suggest factual damnation implied within or in light of its teaching on the final judgment itself. And these two paragraphs in the Catechism, paragraph 998 and 1038, simply reaffirm and continue to teach and echo what the 1215 Lateran Council's Confession of Faith states. But we're going to have to get to that on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. I'm Dr. Carlo Broussard. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason. Again, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I'm Dr. Carlo Broussard. In today's episode, we're talking about the Church's teaching on the doctrine of hell. So far, in our first two segments, we looked at the Church's teaching on at least the possibility of hell, that it's at least possible that some could in fact die in a state of mortal sin and end up in hell. But of course, that raises the question, what is the Church's teaching concerning factual damnation? Does the Church have anything in its official teaching that would suggest the Church envisions human souls factually ending up in hell, whether that be currently, right now, or at least at the end of time, after the final judgment. And in our last segment, we were looking at least ordinary magisterial teaching that would suggest the church does in fact envision factual damnation for some, at least at the end of time after the final judgment. And we looked at the Synod of Constantinople in AD 543 and Canon 7, where it condemns the idea that there will be a complete restoration of demons and or impious men, affirming that the afterlife punishments of demons and or impious men is indeed everlasting. And I argued why that is not a conditional statement, but a factual statement, thereby providing us at least ordinary grounds from the ordinary magisterium that the church envisions factual damnation of some human beings at the end of time after the final judgment. And then we also looked at the church's teaching on the final, we began to look at the church's teaching on the final judgment itself. I referenced the Confession of Faith from the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, where it affirms that both the righteous and the unrighteous, the good and the wicked, will rise at the end of time for judgment, the wicked going to everlasting punishment, the righteous going to glory, everlasting glory. And I argued for why that's factual as well and not merely conditional. If those going into glory is not conditional, where we know in fact some are numbered among the elect, that would imply that those numbered among the wicked is factual as well and not merely conditional. Now, I left off teeing up a couple of paragraphs from the Catechism that just simply echoes the Fourth Lateran Council's teaching on the final judgment. In paragraphs 998 and 1038 of the Catechism is following in the same tradition, affirming that the final judgment will involve both the righteous and the unrighteous, with the righteous going to heaven and the unrighteous going to damnation. Paragraph 1034 in the Catechism is another magisterial text concerning the final judgment. And I don't think there's any room for it being hypothetical. It reads as follows: Jesus often speaks of Gehenna, of the unquenchable fire reserved for those who, to the end of their lives, refuse to believe and be converted, where both soul and body can be lost. Jesus solemnly proclaims that he will send his angels and they will gather all evildoers and throw them into the furnace of fire, and that he will pronounce the condemnation. Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire. The line about the angels gathering all evildoers and throwing them into the furnace of fire is a quote from Matthew chapter 13, verses 41 through 42, concerning the final judgment rendered by the Son of Man. The Catechism affirms, therefore, that evildoers will be present at the final judgment and will be placed in hell. Now, the question becomes, well, can we discern from magisterial teaching that the church envisions there being souls in hell right now? So far, we've only looked at magisterial teaching that affirms, so I have argued, factual damnation of human souls, at least at the end of time after the final judgment. But of course, that raises the important question, what about the church's envisioning of souls being in hell right now? Well, I think we can. I think there is magisterial teaching that allows for us to make that conclusion that the church envisions factual damnation of human souls currently. Let's go back to Canon 7 of the Synod of Constantinople. Recall, the canon states, if anyone says or holds that the punishment of the demons and of impious men is temporary, and that it will have an end at some time, that is to say, there will be a complete restoration of the demons or of impious men, let him be anathema. Now, as I mentioned before, this canon presupposes the church's belief that demons were factually in hell at the time the canon was issued. It's such a belief that prompts the question of whether such punishments were temporary or not. You can't ask the question of whether their punishments are temporary unless you're first presupposing that they're factually being punished right now in the afterlife. Now, remember, the canon doesn't only address the question of whether the punishments of demons are temporary. It also addresses the question of whether the punishments of impious men are temporary. Given this parallel, it's reasonable to conclude that just as the canon presupposes the factual damnation of demons at the time the canon is issued, so too the canon presupposes the factual damnation of impious men at the time the canon is issued. Why would the canon presuppose the factual damnation of one, namely the demons, and not the other, namely the impious men, when addressing the question of whether the punishments of both categories of individuals is temporary or not? It would be misleading to presuppose the factual damnation of one, the demons, and not the other, impious men. Since the synod envisioned souls to be in hell with the demons then, at that time the canon is issued, and their punishments are everlasting, it follows that the church would still envision souls and demons to be in hell right now. So I think Canon 7 of the Synod of Constantinople, at least on the level of ordinary magisterium, affirms for us this idea that the church is envisioning factual damnation of some, both human souls and demons, currently, right here and right now, presently. At the time the canon is issued, it's envisioning that there are some human souls and demons in the afterlife being punished. And the canon is affirming that their punishments will not be temporary, but rather will be everlasting. So I think this provides for us strong evidence, at least again, on the ordinary level of magisterium, factual damnation currently of both human souls and demons. Now, I think we can also turn back to the Fourth Lateran Council's Confession of Faith for another argument that the church envisions souls in hell right now. Recall, it states that Christ will come at the end of time, quote, to judge the living and the dead and to render each according to his works, to the wicked as well as to the elect, all of whom will rise with their bodies, which they now bear. Notice how the confession states that both the wicked and the elect will be judged, and then says, all of whom will rise with their bodies, which they now bear. The implication here seems to be that there are some living at the time of the council who will be numbered among the wicked that go to hell, and they will rise at the general resurrection. Tim Staples makes this point or this argument in his online article, Are There Souls in Hell Right Now? At Catholic.com, and I would encourage you to check that out. We can be sure that those living at the time that would be numbered among the wicked died and thus exist in the afterlife before the general resurrection, right? Those that the council is envisioning living at that time have died, and so currently would be numbered among the wicked right now. We know that they will rise to get their bodies back and will be sent to everlasting punishment with the devil. So, I mean, at least we can affirm at the end of time, right? Surely they would have died before the general resurrection. But the question is, where are these wicked now? It's obvious that they can't be in heaven. They can't be in purgatory, since that's a place only for the just, though imperfectly purified. And to say that perhaps they're in a state of limbo, that wouldn't cohere with the church's teaching about the particular judgment in paragraph 1022 in the Catechism, which states that after death, the souls enter into either the souls enter into either the blessed of heaven through a purification or immediate and everlasting damnation. So the Catechism here doesn't allow for a third option like limbo. So the bottom line is here, those who were numbered among the wicked at the time of the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, upon dying, must have entered into hell. Now, someone might counter and say that this could just as easily be read as a hypothetical. If there are some who die, would be numbered among the wicked. If there are some who die numbered among the wicked, well, then they will rise with the bodies that they bore at the time of the council. But such a hypothetical reading doesn't fit with the elect. We wouldn't say that the council's reference to the elect is hypothetical, since that would imply that only if there are some numbered among the elect that will rise with their bodies that they had at the time of the council. But the church believes there are, in fact, some numbered among the elect. We have canonizations of saints, right? Since we don't read the council statement as a hypothetical for the elect, well, then we shouldn't read the council statement as a hypothetical for the wicked. Or to state it differently, if the council envisions some living at the time of the council to be numbered among the elect, then we can conclude that the council also envisions some living at the time of the council to be numbered among the wicked as well. And if numbered among the wicked, then those wicked would have died sometime subsequent to the council and would be in hell currently. So I do think that the Fourth Lateran Council's confession of faith concerning the final judgment and the final resurrection implies that it is envisioning that there are some who will be numbered among the elect subsequent to the council, and thereby envisioning some numbered among, I don't know if I said elect or the wicked, I apologize if I said elect, but envisioning some to be numbered among the wicked subsequent to the council, ending up in hell, and therefore some in hell right now. Friends, I got to take my last break. Stay tuned. Talk to you on the other side. Well, welcome back to our last and final segment of today's episode of The Catholic Reason. We have been looking at the Church's teaching on the doctrine of hell, and we've provided magisterial evidence, at least on the ordinary level, of the possibility of hell. And then we've provided evidence, at least on the ordinary level, for factual damnation, at least at the end of time after the final judgment. And then we were, in our last segment, providing magisterial evidence, at least on the ordinary level of magisterial teaching, of factual damnation currently, that the Church does teach certain things that would imply the Church envisioning the human souls being in hell right now. We looked at Canon 7 of the Synod of Constantinople in AD 543, which I argued necessarily implies that the Church is envisioning impious men to be in hell at the time the canon was issued, and it declaring that their punishments are not temporary but everlasting. Therefore, we can affirm that the Church envisions souls to be in hell currently right now. And then we also appealed to the Fourth Lateran Council's confession of faith, talking about at the final judgment, both the righteous and the unrighteous will be raised in the bodies that they had at the time of the council, which I argued suggests that the council envisions there to be some factually numbered among the wicked who would be among the damned at the time of the council, or subsequent to the time of the council. When they would die, they would go to hell, and therefore hell being eternal, we can affirm that the Church envisions souls to be in hell right now. Now, there are three more arguments that I want to give for factual damnation, of present factual damnation. One of those three can be made from the Church's teaching on the final resurrection itself. Recall the teaching of the Fourth Lateran Council and the Catechism. The resurrection of the dead consists of both the just and the unjust. Previously, we were making an argument from just final judgment of both righteous and unrighteous. Now we're going to make an argument from the final resurrection. Jesus says in John 5:28-29, the righteous will rise to the resurrection of life, the unrighteous to the resurrection of judgment or damnation. Now, for there to be a resurrection of the unrighteous must have been existing somewhere in the afterlife prior to the resurrection. But such an existence couldn't be heaven or purgatory. Therefore, it must have been hell. So at least the moment prior to the final resurrection, the Church with Jesus envisions souls present in hell. The question now becomes, well, are there any souls in hell currently, and will there be any up until this final moment prior to the final resurrection? Well, it seems reasonable to say there is and there will be. For if there aren't any souls in hell currently, and will not be any souls in hell up until the time of this moment prior to the final resurrection, well, then the question becomes, why the radical shift? Why would it be that no soul has gone to hell up until now and will not be there up until the moment prior to the final resurrection, but then souls will be in hell at that moment prior to the final resurrection? Because remember, in order for the wicked to rise, they have to be coming from somewhere, and it can't be heaven or purgatory, so it's got to be hell. It seems a bit arbitrary to make that assertion. No souls in hell up until now, no souls in hell up until this final moment prior to the final resurrection, but then souls in hell at that moment. There's no reasonable explanation for the sudden and radical shift. I suppose we could formulate our argument this way. Premise 1, if human souls will be damned in the future, at the moment prior to the final resurrection and thereafter, well, then it's reasonable to conclude that human souls have been damned in the past up to this time and will be damned up to the moment prior to the final resurrection, lest we have this arbitrary radical shift. Premise 2, human souls will be damned in the future, at least at the moment prior to the final resurrection and after the final judgment. Therefore, it's reasonable to conclude that human souls have been damned in the past up to this time and will be damned up to the moment prior to the final resurrection. So notice this is an argument based upon what is revealed to us about the final resurrection and what will happen, the state of existence after the final judgment, and this idea of a radical shift. We know for sure that there will be souls in hell, so we have argued, there will be souls in hell immediately prior to the final resurrection, and that there will be factual damnation of souls after the final judgment. So the idea here is if we think about this hypothesis, there have been no souls in hell up until this current moment in time when I'm speaking, and there will be no souls in hell all the way up to that moment prior to the final resurrection, but then there will be souls in hell. That seems to be an unnecessary radical shift. The more reasonable conclusion would be that those souls that were in hell immediately prior to the final resurrection, they're there right now. Okay? And they have been there since they died. That's the more reasonable explanation, I think. Now, we can also make an argument from paragraph 633 in the Catechism and the Catechism's teaching on Jesus' descent into hell. I think this provides us further evidence that the Church envisions factual damnation even now, and so we can infer at the time Jesus descends into the dead. Here's what the Catechism states in paragraph 633. Scripture calls the abode of the dead to which the dead Christ went down, quote unquote, hell, Sheol in Hebrew or Hades in Greek, because those who are there are deprived of the vision of God. Such is the case for all the dead, whether evil or righteous, while they await the Redeemer, which does not mean that their lot is identical, as Jesus shows through the parable of the poor man Lazarus, who was received into, quote unquote, Abraham's bosom. It is precisely these holy souls who awaited their Savior in Abraham's bosom, whom Christ the Lord delivered when he descended into hell. And here's the money quote. Jesus did not descend into hell to deliver the damned, nor to destroy the hell of damnation, but to free the just who had gone before him. Now, there are several things to point out here. Notice the line, Jesus did not descend into hell to deliver the damned, nor to destroy the hell of damnation, but to free the just who had gone before him. The Catechism implies that the hell, or the abode of the dead that Jesus descended into, consisted not only of the righteous, but the damned as well, which necessarily means there is factual damnation of human souls, and that they were human souls and not merely demons, as supported by the context. The paragraph speaks of the dead, whether evil or righteous. That's not language commonly used for demons. So the Catechism is talking about human souls in the afterlife that are righteous or evil, implying factual damnation. It also uses the story of Lazarus and the rich man, human beings, as a reference point for articulating the different lots in this abode of the dead, thereby reaffirming human souls existing among the dead, among the damned. Moreover, since the Catechism speaks of these holy souls in Abraham's bosom and juxtaposes their lot with the lot of the damned, it's reasonable to conclude that the writers of the Catechism were thinking of human souls when they spoke of, quote unquote, the damned. And so paragraph 633 in the Church's teaching on Christ's descent into the dead And the juxtaposition of the lot of those in Abraham's bosom with the damned suggests that the writers of the Catechism were envisioning human souls factually existing among the damned in quote-unquote hell when Jesus descended into the dead. And finally, there's one last argument that I think we can make. The Catechism is clear in paragraph 1035 that the teaching of the Church affirms the existence of hell and its eternity. Now, for those who say the Church doesn't necessarily envision hell being currently populated by human souls, the question becomes, how can hell exist and be real if there are no souls there? Hell, at least currently before the final resurrection, is not some local place where it might or might not be empty of something. Rather, as the Catechism defines in paragraph 1033, hell is a definitive self-exclusion from communion with God. So given the nature of hell, to affirm that hell is real necessarily implies there are souls who have definitively excluded themselves from communion with God. That's to say, there are souls in hell. Now, someone might say, well, the Catechism's affirmation of the reality of hell could refer just to demons. Well, the first thing to say in response there is that this would just support my previous argument from the 543 Synod of Constantinople, which I argued gives evidence that the Church envisioned human souls to be factually in hell at the time the Council issued its Canon 7. And then secondly, paragraph 1035 speaks of human souls in relation to the existence of hell. So it seems to me, therefore, that insofar as the Catechism affirms the reality of hell, it affirms that there are souls currently existing of hell. You cannot affirm the reality of hell without there being souls there, because hell is not some place that could be empty of things. Hell is the definitive self-exclusion from God. So with these 5 arguments in hand that I've articulated here, I think we can conclude that at least in her ordinary teaching, the Church envisions hell to be currently populated. Well, my friends, that's all the time we have for this week's episode of The Catholic Reason. My claim today is that the Church envisions not only the possibility of hell for human souls, but also factual damnation of human souls, both after the final judgment and even presently. Thanks for listening to The Catholic Reason, again, a production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Remember, you can download the show through whichever podcast platform that you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. And you can also access the archived episodes at my website, carlobroussard.com, under both the audio and video tab. Be sure to check out all the other great resources I have there. I invite you to join me again next week for The Catholic Reason as we continue looking at Catholic claims and the reasons behind them. Friends, you tell a friend, and I'll talk to you then. God bless.